So that sense of what we love, of course, we've lost. So unless the sustainability you're talking about measures those indicators of the things we actually love and like, we're not going to get anywhere at all. So how can one move forward? I think just if we analyse what's going on there, what I've in essence said is the problem is, you can already see these linear lines, is parallel lives. And why have we got parallel lives? We've got parallel lives because there's parallel thinking in boxes, in departmental thinking, precisely the opposite of integration. And that, of course, gives partial visions, which means that things never connect. You never get that wonderful equation, which is 1 + 1 = 3. Now, this is a map of knowledge. I'm just reminding you. This map of knowledge proves to me the segmentation and fragmentation of knowledge, when precisely these forms of knowledge, which are flying all over the place, should be having connections, and they don't have connections. A simple way of putting it is the aesthetic and the rational don't come together. The soft sciences and the hard sciences, hardware, software thinking. All of these things are not coming together, which is why we end up with the sort of cities we have. That was an interesting conference, which was about getting out of your box, but it was a relief to get out of the box, I must say. But you get the idea. There is a misalignment between the words we say and the things we do because of the type of things that I've just been describing. And so another way of saying is holistic thinking, but anyway, you know all about that. That was, in a sense, the entree. Because if there wasn't that, and this is an engineering approach to a city, you would suddenly find that you could do that. But normally we end up with a version of that, instead of the different forms of insight coming together and creating something that is completely different and perhaps more livable. So what I'm really trying to say is to think about sustainability, I suppose, more comprehensively, to include a number of things that you may already be taking into account or not, I don't know. Of course, I'm assuming the triple, whatever it is, the triple, the environmental, economic and social, but are the other things being incorporated in your indicator set as well? So what that means in particular is obviously, and I'm focusing on acknowledging the commonplace, the ordinary, the cultural, the local, the particular, the distinctive, and the pull back, which is what you would call culture. And I don't mean it in a sense that we're being nostalgic and it's fixed forever in any sense, because of course I know it's continually negotiated and evolves over time. So we could say there are four pillars of sustainability. We could say that rather than 3. Or we could say, what should we really do? Should we really say culture is cross-cutting? People say that because they can't deal with what I've just said normally. They say, oh, it's cross-cutting, and therefore we'll forget it, in fact. And that's what, because it is cross-cutting. I would agree with people who say it's cross-cutting. But why the hell, if it is cross-cutting, why isn't it the most important thing that is the defining characteristics of how you look at sustainability in the first place? Because the lack of sustainability is, of course, a cultural problem. So, perhaps we should go back to something which I actually think is ultimately weaker and say it's a 4th pillar, because then at least it has, you know, we have to look at the 4th pillar. So that's a dilemma that I can't really deal with, but you will probably. But what is it that makes us understand place? It's understanding those 5 or 6 things I've got there, the character, qualities, values, meaning of a place, which essentially is cultural literacy. I hope you've got indicators for that in your sustainability set. The other thing, and that's obviously about who we are, where we belong, how we're evolving. The other one, what optimizes the potential of a place? Well, it's adding value and value simultaneously, I think. Finding things that therefore unleash assets and resources, which is about understanding cultural resources in the first place. Because all of that stuff I just talked about is ultimately, the stuff of the place, is a resource for the city to use in terms of this to make it, let's say, more environmentally sustainable. And what helps transform change? In fact, it's working with the culture. When you work with the grain of an existing culture, people are much more adaptable to change, and behaving differently in a sustainable way is an adaptation. than when you work against it. So, in a sense, I think your project is a cultural project, and creative thinking and all this stuff, artistic thinking, can help. So I hope your culture is not frozen. Sorry, this is a yoga shop, but you get the drift of what I'm trying to say. Is not sort of etched into aspic, and that it is, in some sense, alive. In some way that it's recreating itself. As Tilburg, by the way, my two friends from Tilburg, they will recognise that. That it is actually alive and alert and awake. Or even here, I found this very interesting in Ghent last week. Anarchy is order, capitalism is chaos. It's quite interesting, but that in itself is part of the culture I've been talking about. So here are just some examples I want to go through, which are incorporating that. Now obviously the basic thing when people talk about culture, they always think you're talking about the creative economy, the creative industries, the property developers, so let's get a few creatives in and the value of the property will go up. I'm not talking about that, of course that happens, some of it is very interesting, some of it's very important. But I just want to go more into the social direction because you've got the sustainability and social issues in your programme. And I think, for example, this project, Es un Solar in Zaragoza, is a great example of blending these things I'm talking about. These are all ruins and horrible spaces in the city which are difficult, where there might be drug addicts, where people are throwing rubbish and so on. And a group of architects, artists and others came together to, with the community, identify what you could do with each of these spaces. So, number 9, they decided they wanted a basketball thing. Number 3, they just wanted a place which was an Acaturana project, which you'll be well aware of. In a sense, is a counterweight to saying, let us recapture ourselves, the sort of imagery with which we live, rather than only being invaded by, in a sense, in this case, advertising. So they want to join Europe, as you can see. But what I'm just trying to point out here is the question of empowerment, you controlling or beginning to control the image and the perception of the city as it evolves. Nobody's saying here that you need to like it, but I'm just thinking that what you're seeing here is a different aesthetic evolving in a city that was formerly completely grey. You know, here's washing hanging out, real washing, but some is not real washing and so on, which makes the city have a completely different feeling. And as the mayor said, I can't solve the problems inside the buildings, but I can change the psychological feeling of being there. So this is the way to the airport. It's pretty clear which direction it is. So that's a collage. Let's just take another example, which is really embedding in the environment your intent, the green intent that you're all talking about. What does that look like? Does it look the same? I've been to places where people are saying, we've got this incredible sustainability project, it looks exactly the same as everything else, so you don't really know it. So that the actual aesthetics is not helping you drive your project, and therefore people are not communicating well enough. Freiburg is well known, as it says here in the Opera House, in what sort of future do we want to live, rather than what is the next opera programme. There's the Sonnenschiff, which means obviously the sunship, is already telling you that this is to do with obviously solar heating. Each of these buildings here is carbon neutral. But you already, through the visual experience, can see that something else is going on, which helps generate, ultimately, I think, behavioural change. And as you know, they've got one of the biggest solar institutes in the world in Freiburg, the Fraunhofer Institute. Or if you just take this is Malmö, again very well known, where you've got the icon, the turning torso, Calatrava. You've got very ordinary buildings. But in a sense, when you look near the ground, you can see what's happening. And because you can see how it works, and mostly we don't know how anything works anymore, because you can see how it works, it helps you understand why it's important and helps that change. And interestingly, there are very creative things. They could have done the buildings all straight, but they did it according to the wind. Because in that wind-shaded area, if I can call it that, it's 4 degrees higher than outside. And so the prices of the inside buildings that don't have a view to the sea are the same as those that do. And lots of what's helping that, of course, these wind turbines. But look at the aesthetic here in Paris. I think the Briolot administration building, which is a hydroponic building, is a new form of aesthetic and icons next to the Eiffel Tower, which is why I put these together. But it reminds you again, by looking at that, you ask yourself questions. You say, is this greenwash? Is this just rubbish? Or is something else going on here that will make me think? Or Chicago's municipality building has, you know, lots of apiaries, beehives, and you can buy council honey. Again, trying to tell you that we need to live in a different way. So these are all variations of that. This is the Shanghai Pavilion in the Expo, which is again trying to develop a new aesthetic around green. But the main point I'm making is creating the environment in such a way that it's sending the messages and helping you do what you want to do in any case. Take this here. This is Amsterdam, the Zuidas, the business district that they all want to make look wonderful. But these are the sort of things that are nearby, the ING headquarters. But then they get an artist group to say, a few years later, what is the Zuidas? I thought you just spent 3 billion euros on it, so you know what the Zuidas is. Well, that's interesting, because they realise that there's a lack of sustainability in terms of what it feels like when you have buildings like that around. That might look okay in the architect's brochure, but what does it feel like? Nearby in the wharf, the NDSM wharf, this is the guidelines by the urban planning people and saying, this is what we want you to do. I want you to make this development feel like this. Completely different. Now, why are they saying feel like this? Because in campsites, of course, social life, there's an element of social life and connection that you lose when you often do the typical other sort of structures and buildings and so on. So a lot of that around that area is a bit weird like this, but there's something about that that we should not lose.